Tracks tells, surprise, anger, calculation, more calculation. The man was running numbers, weighing outcomes, measuring his daughter's proposal against his own objectives. 6 of the 9 Valdrin council members leaned forward. Ruth, the senior elder, was nodding slowly. 2 others, younger, harder-faced, sitting nearest to a dark-haired man who Lena identified immediately as Declan Marsh, based on nothing more than the way he held himself, coiled and watchful, remained stone-faced. Declan did not speak, he watched. His eyes moved between Kieran and Lena and Nina with the patient, measuring gaze of a man who was not participating in this conversation because he was planning a different one. Lena felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. Not the bond, not the wolf. Plain, old-fashioned human instinct telling her that Declan Marsh was dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with ambition. The negotiation lasted 4 hours. Details were argued, concessions were traded, territorial maps were redrawn with colored pencils on paper that would later be formalized in treaty documents. Grant Ashford pushed back on the mineral rights. Nina pushed forward. Kieran sat at the head of the table and let them negotiate, intervening only when the terms crossed a line he wouldn't bend on. By noon, they had a framework, not a treaty, a framework, a skeleton that would need flesh and detail, but a direction. Grant Ashford looked at his daughter with an expression that had shifted from calculation to something that might, in a generous light, have been respect. "This is your doing," he said to Nina. "This is everyone's doing," Nina said, which was diplomatic and also completely false. It was Nina's doing. Everyone in the room knew it. The session adjourned. The 72-hour deadline, with less than 3 hours remaining, was officially suspended, pending treaty finalization. Grant Ashford returned to the West Wing. The council dispersed. Owen let out a breath he'd apparently been holding for 4 hours. Lena stepped out of the great hall into the corridor and almost walked into Declan Marsh. He was standing just outside the door, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and he was looking at her with eyes that were green and cold and amused in a way that had no warmth in it. "The rogue wolf who stopped a war," he said. "Impressive. I didn't stop anything. Nina did. Nina performed. You orchestrated." He tilted his head. "Everyone in that room knows the proposal came through you, including Kieran. Including Grant." He paused. "Including me. Is that a problem?" "Not yet." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that makes you check that the exits you memorized are still where you left them. "Welcome to the Valdrin pack, Lena. I'm sure you'll fit right in." He walked away. His footsteps were quiet on the stone floor. Too quiet for a man his size. The kind of quiet that comes from training, from practice, from being someone who has learned to move without being heard. Lena watched him go and felt the cold certainty settle into her stomach like a stone. The war with the Ashfords might be ending, but the war inside the Valdrin pack was just beginning. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She lay in the bed that cost more than her life and stared at the timber ceiling and listened to the compound settle around her and felt the bond pulsing steady and warm in her chest and thought about Declan Marsh's smile. The lodge was quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when an entire community has been holding its breath for 3 days and has finally exhaled. Guards at the outer doors. Maggie's light still on in the kitchen, because Maggie's light was always on in the kitchen. The fire in the main hall banked to coals. She ended up at Kieran's study. The door was open. He was inside, standing at the window, and she knew before she entered that he hadn't slept either. "Declan," she said. He turned. "What about him?" "He cornered me in the corridor after the session. He was polite. He was pleasant. He made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Declan makes everyone's hair stand up. It's his primary social skill. I'm serious. So am I." Kieran moved away from the window. Declan Marsh has been positioning himself for a challenge since before the Ashford Treaty. He's patient, he's smart, and he's dangerous. The bonding disruption gave him ammunition. The treaty negotiation, the concessions, the perceived weakness, gave him more. How much more does he need? One moment, One wrong step, one demonstration that the alpha is compromised. He looked at her. Having a mate should make an alpha stronger. In the old traditions it does. But Declan will frame it differently. He'll argue that I chose a bond over a pack, a rogue over stability. He'll make it about judgment. And his supporters on the council? 2, maybe 3, not enough for a formal challenge. Yet, what stops him? Strength, certainty, the appearance that nothing has shaken me, a pause. And you? Me? The mate of an alpha is not a decoration, Lena. You're a signal. If you're strong, the pack reads strength. If you're uncertain, they read uncertainty. Declan is watching you as closely as he's watching me. Then he's watching a woman who hasn't shifted in 3 years and doesn't know how to be anything to anyone. He's watching a woman who brokered a peace deal from the side of a room she wasn't invited into. Give yourself more credit. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that what he was seeing was survival instinct, not strength, that she was good at reading rooms because her life had depended on reading rooms, that she was good at exits because she'd needed exits, that every skill he was admiring was a scar dressed up as competence. She didn't say any of that. She stood in his study and looked at the maps on his desk and said, "What happens now?" The treaty is finalized over the next week. Nina and Grant return to Ashford territory. The co-governance structure is implemented over the following month. And we deal with whatever Declan is planning. And us? The word us hung in the air between them. 2 letters carrying the weight of a biological imperative, and 3 years of searching and a bond that neither of them had chosen, but both of them were standing inside of. That, Kieran said, is up to you. She looked at him. He was being careful. She could see it. The effort it took him not to step forward, not to close the distance, not to let his wolf do what every instinct in his body was screaming for it to do. He was holding himself back with the same iron control he used to hold his pack together, and it was costing him, and he was doing it because he had promised her open doors and he meant it. "I need time," she said. "You have it. I don't know how to be in a pack. I don't know how to be with someone. I don't know how to do any of this." Then we learn. Just like that? Just like that. She left his study. The door stayed open behind her. The treaty was signed 4 days later. Nina Ashford put her name on the document beside Kieran's with a pen that probably cost more than Lena's motorcycle, and the 2 packs formally entered into a partnership that looked, on paper, like something designed by people who actually cared about outcomes instead of optics. Nina shook Kieran's hand. She shook Lena's hand. She held Lena's grip for 1 beat longer than protocol required, and said, very quietly, "Don't let him waste this." "I won't," Lena said, and meant it in a way that surprised her. The Ashford delegation departed. The compound exhaled. And for 3 days, the Valdrin pack experienced something it hadn't experienced in decades. Normalcy. Training resumed, the school reopened. Maggie's kitchen produced meals at regular intervals instead of crisis rations. Owen stopped sleeping in the corridor outside Kieran's quarters. Lena spent those 3 days learning. She walked the compound. She met wolves, not formally, not as the alpha's mate, but as a person. She learned names. She learned routines. She helped Maggie in the kitchen because kitchens were familiar and because Maggie was the kind of person who communicated through feeding and who asked no questions she didn't need the answers to. She learned the compound's rhythms, who trained at dawn, who patrolled at night, who gathered in the main hall in the evenings and who stayed in their quarters. She learned the social geography, the alliances and tensions and unspoken hierarchies that existed beneath the formal structure. And she watched Declan Marsh. He didn't do anything overt. That was what made him dangerous. He trained with the younger wolves, mentored them, built loyalty one conversation at a time. He was present at every meal, every gathering, every public space where opinions were formed and loyalties were tested. He was charming. He was competent. He was the kind of leader who makes you feel seen. And Lena recognized the technique because she had seen it before, in a different pack, wielded by a different man, with different consequences. She told Kieran. He nodded. He already knew. Knowing isn't the same as stopping it, she said. No, but forcing it out into the open before he's ready gives us the advantage. And if he's ready before we think he is. Kieran didn't answer that. The attack came on the 7th night. Lena was in her room, the room she'd slept in since arriving, adjacent to Kieran's quarters but separate, because they hadn't bridged that distance yet, and he hadn't pushed. She was sitting on the bed, reading a book she'd borrowed from his study, when the door opened. Not the way Kieran opened doors, announced, deliberate, with a knock or a word. This door opened silently, quickly, and 3 figures slipped through it in the space between one heartbeat and the next. They were shifted, half-forms, upright, human-sized, but with claws extended and eyes blazing amber. They moved in formation, trained, coordinated, and they were coming for her with a speed that left no room for negotiation. Her wolf exploded. Not gradually, not the slow awakening she'd felt over the past week, the cautious stirring, the tentative stretches. This was an eruption. 3 years of suppressed power detonating in her chest like a bomb, ripping through her body with a force that turned her vision gold and her bones liquid and her skin into something else entirely. She shifted. For the first time in 3 years, Lena Cole shifted, and what came out was not what anyone expected. She was massive. That was the first thing, the sheer scale of her wolf form, disproportionate to her human body, larger than any female wolf in the compound and larger than most males. Her fur was black, not brown, not gray, not any of the natural colors that pack wolves displayed. Black from nose to tail, solid, absolute, the kind of black that doesn't reflect light but absorbs it. And her eyes were not amber, they were gold. Her pure, bright, burning gold, the color that existed in pack mythology as the mark of a primal bloodline, the original wolves, the ones who predated the pack system, the ones who were not born into hierarchy but who created it. The 3 attackers froze. One of them, the largest, a brown-furred male with a scar across his muzzle, made a sound that was not a growl but a whimper, involuntary. The sound a wolf makes when every cell in its body is screaming submit. Lena didn't think. She moved. 3 years of dormancy, 3 years of silence, 3 years of pretending she was only human, and her wolf remembered everything. It remembered how to fight the way breathing remembers how to continue, after you've held your breath too long. The first attacker went down before he could raise his claws. She caught him at the shoulder, drove him sideways into the wall, and pinned him there with a force that cracked the timber. The second lunged. She twisted, caught his wrist in her jaws, not biting down, not breaking bone, but holding with a pressure that said I could, and threw him across the room. The third one, the one with the scar, didn't even try. He dropped to the floor, belly exposed, throat bared, the universal wolf signal for I am no longer a participant in this event. The fight lasted 11 seconds. Lena stood in the middle of the room, shifted, breathing hard, golden-eyed, with 3 wolves on the floor around her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Whole. The door burst open again. Kieran. He was half-shifted, eyes blazing, claws out, and he came through the doorway ready for a fight that was already over. He stopped. He looked at the 3 wolves on the ground. He looked at Lena. She was still shifted, still enormous, still black-furred and gold-eyed and radiating a power that made the air in the room heavy, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not fear, not aggression, not panic, but something quieter, something that asked, "Are you here?" He shifted, fully. His wolf was gray, large, built like a fortress. He approached her not as an alpha, not with authority or dominance. He approached her low, slow, with his throat exposed. The offering of a mate. She let him close. He pressed his muzzle against her neck, and the bond between them, the thing that had dragged her across state lines and rewritten her biology and upended both their lives, clicked into its final position like the last tumbler in a lock. The claiming was not a ceremony. It was not political. It was not public. It happened in a damaged room with cracked walls and unconscious traitors on the floor, and it was ugly and real and private, and it belonged to no one but them. Afterward, Kieran shifted back. He looked at the three wolves, now shifting back to human, groaning, battered, and recognized them immediately. Declan's wolves. Declan's loyalists. Declan's move. "Owen," he said into the radio on the bedside table. "My quarters, now." Owen arrived in 45 seconds. He took one look at the room, one look at Lena, one look at the three men on the floor, and said, "Well, that's going to simplify things." Declan Marsh was found in his quarters 30 minutes later. He was not packing. He was not running. He was sitting in a chair, waiting, with the calm patience of a man who had expected this to end differently, but was prepared for any outcome. Kieran gave him a choice, formal banishment or a challenge. Declan chose banishment, not because he was afraid. Lena could see that he wasn't, but because he was smart enough to know that challenging an alpha whose mate had just flattened 3 of his best fighters in 11 seconds was not a winning proposition. He left that night. No ceremony, no farewell. He walked into the forest with nothing but the clothes on his back, and the pack closed behind him like water filling a hole. The next morning, the compound woke to a new reality. Word traveled fast, not just about the attack, not just about Declan's banishment, but about Lena, about her shift, about the size of her wolf, about the color of her eyes, gold eyes, primal bloodline, the old blood that the pack system was built on. Lena didn't address it. She didn't make a speech. She didn't stand before the pack and explain herself, because there was nothing to explain. She was what she was. She had always been what she was. The only thing that had changed was that she'd stopped hiding it. Kieran didn't explain it either. He sent a brief message to Nina Ashford, informing her that an internal challenge had been resolved, and the treaty was unaffected. Nina's response was 2 words: "Good, noted." Ruth, the senior elder, came to Lena that afternoon. She was old, the kind of old that carries weight, that has earned the right to say things other people wouldn't dare. She sat down across from Lena, in the main hall, and studied her with eyes that had seen 6 decades of pack history. "Your mother," Ruth said. "What was her name?" Lena went still. The question hit a nerve she'd spent 3 years burying, and it took her a moment to find the words. "Clara, Clara Cole." Ruth nodded slowly. "Clara's daughter. We heard about the burning. We thought you were dead." "Almost. Your mother was primal blood. The pack she belonged to, they knew what she was, what you would be. That's why they tried to destroy you. A primal wolf in a traditional pack is a threat to the hierarchy by existing. I know what I am. Do you? Because what you are is not just a wolf with old blood. What you are is the reason the pack system exists. The first alphas were primals, the hierarchy, the structure, the laws. They were built by wolves like you, and then the system grew, and the primals became inconvenient, and the packs that carried the bloodline were systematically eliminated or absorbed. Eliminated? Yes, like my mother's pack tried to eliminate me. Yes, Lena sat with that, the weight of it, the scope. Her mother's pack hadn't driven her out because of a rejected mating bond. That was the excuse, the cover story, the reason they told themselves. They'd driven her out because she was a primal, because her wolf carried an authority that predated their alphas, because her existence was a living argument that the entire hierarchy was built on a foundation it had tried to bury. "Kieran knows?" she asked. Kieran suspected. He didn't know until last night. And the pack? The pack saw a woman defend herself against 3 attackers and win in 11 seconds. They don't need the genealogy lesson. They understand power. Ruth stood up. "You're not a Luna, Lena. You're something older than that. What you do with it is your choice." Ruth left. Lena sat in the main hall alone and thought about choices and power and the shape of a life that kept expanding beyond the borders she'd drawn for it. She found Kieran on the roof. Their spot, apparently. It had become that without either of them naming it. He was sitting against the chimney stack, legs stretched out, face turned up to the morning sun. He looked more rested than she'd seen him since they'd met, and she realized with a start that the bond had settled. It was no longer a pull, or a scream, or a lock clicking into place. It was just there, warm, steady, present. She sat beside him, closer than before, 1 foot of cedar shingle instead of 3. "Ruth told me about the primal bloodline," she said. "I figured she would." "You knew." "I suspected. The dreams, they were too strong for a normal bond. The range, the persistence, the way my wolf was pulled toward you before we'd ever met. That's not standard mate bond behavior. That's old blood calling to old blood. And you didn't tell me. I didn't have confirmation until you shifted, and I wanted you to learn it on your own terms, not from me." She considered being angry. She decided she was too tired and too comfortable sitting on this roof in the morning sun with a man whose heartbeat she could feel inside her own chest. "I'm not going to be what they want me to be," she said. "No one's asking you to be. Ruth said I'm something older than a Luna. That sounds like a job title. I don't want a job title. I just got out of a job that required a name tag." "Then don't take one. Your pack will expect something. My pack just watched you put down 3 trained fighters in your sleep. They're not expecting anything except for you to be exactly what you are." She pulled a piece of gas station jerky out of her jacket pocket. She'd stashed it there 3 days ago and forgotten about it. Old habits, the habits of a woman who'd spent 3 years making sure she always had food within reach, because hunger was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. She tore it in half, held out a piece. Kieran looked at the jerky. He looked at her. He took it. They sat on the roof and ate gas station jerky and watched the compound wake up below them, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed to be said. The bond was steady. The doors were open. The pack was intact. The war hadn't come, and Lena Cole, packless rogue, truck stop waitress, primal wolf, woman who had spent 3 years running from what she was, had stopped running. Not because someone caught her, not because a bond dragged her back, but because every door was open and she chose to stay. Lena Cole had not shifted in 3 years, and she had made her peace with that, the way a person makes peace with a missing limb. You stop reaching for things on high shelves. You stop expecting your body to do what it used to do. You learn to live smaller. She was 23 years old, 5'6", and she smelled like fryer grease and cheap hand soap. She worked the night shift at a truck stop diner called Hal's off Interstate 90, somewhere between nowhere and the kind of nowhere that doesn't even bother with a zip code. Her uniform was a brown polo 2 sizes too big. Her name tag said L, just the letter. She had stopped using her full name 3 years ago because names are things that can be tracked, and Lena Cole was a name that certain wolves still wanted to find. She poured coffee. She scraped griddles. She mopped floors at 4 in the morning while long-haul truckers slept in their cabs outside, and the fluorescent lights buzzed the same dead note they'd been buzzing since 1987. It was a life built on the principle that if you stayed small enough and quiet enough and human enough, the world that had tried to destroy you would eventually forget you existed. The dream started on a Tuesday. She was mopping the floor behind the counter when the first one hit. Not at night, not in bed, but standing up with her hands on a mop handle and her eyes wide open. 1 second she was scrubbing dried ketchup off linoleum. The next second she was standing in a forest she had never seen, and a voice she had never heard was saying a single word. Home. She dropped the mop. It clattered against the tile, and Reggie, the cook, stuck his head through the kitchen window and said, "You good?" "Yeah," she said. Slipped. She picked up the mop. Her hands were shaking. Something behind her ribs, something she had spent 3 years starving and suffocating and walling off, had just opened one eye. That night, lying on the mattress in her rented room above the diner, she felt it again. Not a dream this time. A pull. Physical. Directional. As real as gravity. Northwest. Her wolf, the part of her she had locked away so deep she'd convinced herself it had simply died, was clawing toward the surface, with a need that felt less like instinct and more like oxygen deprivation. She pressed her face into the pillow and said, "No." The pull did not care about her opinion. By Thursday, she couldn't eat. By Friday, she couldn't sleep. The pull had become a compass needle embedded in her sternum, and it was pointing northwest with the kind of insistence that suggested it would rip through her chest wall if she didn't follow it. Saturday morning she stood behind the register, staring at nothing, and Reggie said, "Girl, you look like you're being haunted." He was more right than he knew. She left that night. She didn't put in 2 weeks. She didn't pack a bag. She left the tips she'd collected in an envelope on the counter with Reggie's name on it, walked out the back door, and stood in the parking lot under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had taken a bat to a chandelier. There was a motorcycle leaning against the dumpster. It belonged to a trucker named Hank who'd been sleeping in his cab for 3 days and who owed Lena $40 in unpaid tabs. She considered this fair compensation, climbed on, turned the key she'd taken from his jacket pocket 3 hours earlier, and pointed the handlebars northwest. She rode for 2 days. She didn't stop except for gas, which she paid for with crumpled bills she'd been hiding inside a sock. She ate gas station jerky and drank gas station coffee, and she crossed 2 state lines without knowing their names, because state lines are a human invention, and the thing pulling her did not care about human inventions. The territory line, though, that was different. She felt it before she saw it. A shimmer in the air, a thickening, like the atmosphere itself had clenched. She crossed an unmarked road at the edge of a pine forest, and the world shifted on its axis. The smells changed. Damp earth, cedar, something metallic and old. The sounds changed. Birdsong cut off mid-note, replaced by a silence that wasn't empty but watchful. She had entered someone's territory. Not just someone's. The pull in her chest had become so strong it was bending her forward on the motorcycle like a hook in her ribcage. She could feel the borders of the pack like walls closing in. Massive, ancient, layered with centuries of scent markings and dominance claims. Whatever pack owned this land had been here since before the country it sat inside had a name. She stopped the motorcycle at the edge of a gravel road, killed the engine, listened. Drums. Distant, rhythmic, the kind that were not music but ceremony. And beneath the drums, howling, not wild, not chaotic, but structured, liturgical, the howling of wolves performing a ritual. Her wolf surged so hard behind her ribs that she gasped and grabbed the handlebars to keep from falling. She didn't know that the drums were for a wedding. She didn't know that the alpha king of the Valdran pack, the largest, most powerful bloodline on the continent, was standing at an altar stone 3 miles from where she sat, preparing to bond with a woman named Nina Ashford in a political union designed to prevent a war that had been building for 40 years. She didn't know that the howling was ceremonial, that 300 wolves had gathered from 6 territories to witness the bonding, that the security perimeter she'd just breached was the most heavily guarded zone in the region. She knew none of this. All she knew was that somewhere in the direction of those drums there was a heartbeat, and it matched hers exactly. She got off the motorcycle and walked into the woods. They caught her in less than 10 minutes. 2 border sentries, big males, shifted, amber-eyed and bristling, materialized from the tree line and had her on the ground before she could take another step. She didn't fight. She couldn't. Her wolf was screaming so loud inside her skull that coordinated movement had become a theoretical concept. They dragged her to their feet. One of them, sandy-haired, square-jawed, the kind of face that was born to follow orders, spoke into a radio clipped to his belt. Perimeter breach, solo female, rogue. The word rogue landed on Lena like a slap. In the pack world, rogue meant packless. Rogue meant disgraced. Rogue meant a wolf so unwanted by its own kind that it had been cast into the wilderness to die alone. It was accurate, and it stung the way accurate things do. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said. "You're on restricted territory during a royal bonding ceremony," said the second sentry. "That's trouble whether you brought it or not." They bound her wrists with zip ties. Not chains, not rope, modern zip ties, because even werewolf packs had been to a hardware store, and marched her through the forest. The trees were massive, old-growth pines that blocked out the sky. The air smelled like sap and power and something electric that made the hair on her arms stand straight. They reached a compound, lodge-style buildings made of dark timber and stone, sprawling across a clearing that had been carved out of the forest with surgical precision. The main building was enormous, cathedral-ceilinged, and the drums were coming from inside. Lena could see light pouring from the windows, warm, golden, the kind of light that means celebration. They didn't take her to the celebration. They took her underground. The holding cell was beneath the ceremonial lodge, carved into the rock foundation. Stone walls, iron door, a single bare bulb. It smelled like damp earth and old fear. She could hear the ceremony above her, footsteps, voices, the rhythmic thump of the drums vibrating through the stone ceiling like a second heartbeat. And underneath all of it, one actual heartbeat, close. So close she could count its beats. It was steady, strong, and it was matching hers pulse for pulse, and the pull in her chest was no longer pointing northwest. It was pointing straight up. She pressed her palms flat against the stone ceiling and closed her eyes. Her wolf was howling inside her. 3 years of silence, 3 years of dormancy, and now it was howling with a force that shook her from the inside out. "I hear you," she whispered to no one. To herself, to the heartbeat above her. "I hear you." The heartbeat paused, just for a second, as if it had heard her too. Then the drums stopped. The voices went quiet. And Lena Cole, packless rogue and truck stop waitress, felt something snap into place between her chest and the ceiling above her that was not a sound, not a feeling, but a fact. A biological, undeniable, irreversible fact that rewrote the rules of her solitary little life in a single silent moment. Mate. The word came from her wolf, not her brain. It came from a place deeper than language, deeper than thought, from the part of her that was not human and had never been human and had been waiting 3 years in the dark for exactly this. Above her, the ceremony had gone silent. 300 wolves held their breath, and somewhere in that silence, a man she had never met set down a ceremonial blade and began to walk. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Lena counted them, because counting was the only thing her brain could do that didn't involve the word that was still reverberating through her skeleton. 4 seconds of absolute geological quiet from the room above. 300 wolves, an entire political alliance, a bonding ceremony that had taken 6 months to negotiate and 2 centuries of tradition to design, all of it frozen. Then the iron door of her cell opened, not gently, not with a key turned by a guard following protocol. It opened because someone on the other side put their hands on it and pulled it off its hinges, with the kind of force that suggested the hinges had offended them personally. 2 men stood in the corridor. One was the sandy-haired sentry who'd caught her in the forest. He looked like someone had just told him the sun was actually the moon, and he needed to update all his records accordingly. The other was a man she had never seen before but recognized immediately. The way you recognize a song you've heard in a dream, the way you recognize your own handwriting on a note you don't remember writing. He was tall, not just tall, constructed vertically in a way that made the corridor feel like it had been built to the wrong scale. Dark hair, cut short, not styled but managed, a jaw that could have been used to demonstrate right angles in a geometry class. He was wearing a dark suit, formal, ceremonial, the kind of suit a man wears when he's about to make a vow that will bind him to another person for life. The shirt beneath the jacket was white. There was a thin line of blood on his right hand where he'd gripped the iron door. His eyes were gray. Not blue-gray, not steel-gray, not any of the poetic grays that writers assign to eyes they want to make interesting. They were gray the way stone is gray, the way ash is gray, the way the sky looks right before it decides to do something destructive. He stared at her. She stared at him. The pull in her chest was no longer a pull. It was a lock clicking into place. "You," he said. One word. Not a question, not a greeting, an identification. The way you say you, when you pick someone out of a lineup, when you point across a crowded room, when you find the thing you lost 3 years ago in the last place you thought to look. Lena opened her mouth to say something, anything, a name, an explanation, an apology for whatever she had just disrupted, but her wolf chose that exact moment to surge forward with 3 years of pent-up force, and what came out of her mouth was not words. It was a sound, low, involuntary, resonant, a recognition sound, the sound a wolf makes when it finds its mate, and it came from somewhere so deep inside her that she felt it in her teeth. The man's eyes changed. The gray went molten. His pupils expanded until the iris was a thin ring around an abyss, and his jaw clenched so hard she could hear his teeth meet, and his hands, one bleeding, one not, curled into fists at his sides. "My name is Kieran Hale," he said. "I am the alpha of the Valdrin pack. I have been dreaming about you for 3 years. I need you to come with me." "I'm in zip ties," Lena said, because apparently her brain had decided that logistics were more manageable than emotion. He looked at her wrists. He reached forward, took the zip ties in one hand, and snapped them like thread. His fingers brushed her skin for less than a second. Every nerve in her body lit up like a city grid after a blackout. She followed him. Not because she chose to, though she did, but because the alternative was standing in a stone cell while her body vibrated itself apart. He walked ahead of her through the corridor, up a flight of stairs carved into the rock, and she followed the line of his shoulders the way a compass follows north. They emerged into light, the ceremonial lodge, cathedral ceiling, massive timber beams, 300 wolves, some in human form, some half-shifted, all frozen, arranged in rows on either side of a central aisle that led to an altar stone at the far end of the room. On the altar stone, a ceremonial blade rested where it had been set down. Beside the altar, an elderly man in white robes stood with his mouth slightly open, one hand raised in a gesture that had been interrupted mid-motion. He was the elder, the officiant, and he looked like someone had just changed the channel on his entire reality. At the altar, standing where the groom had been standing moments ago, was a woman. She was stunning in the way that a loaded weapon is stunning. Tall, lean, dark-skinned, dressed in white ceremonial furs and silver chains that caught the light and threw it back in fragments. Her hair was braided in an intricate crown that must have taken hours to build. Her eyes were black, and they were not looking at Kieran. They were looking at Lena. Nina Ashford, daughter of Alpha Grant Ashford, political bride, the woman whose marriage was supposed to prevent a war, stood at the altar and watched a road-stained, grease-smelling, zip-tie-marked stranger walk up the aisle beside the man who was supposed to be her husband. Lena became aware of several things at once: that she was wearing a truck stop uniform, that her hair hadn't been washed in 2 days, that she smelled like highway exhaust and gas station jerky, that 300 of the most powerful wolves on the continent were staring at her, with expressions ranging from confusion to fury to something that looked uncomfortably like awe, and that the pull in her chest, the pull that had dragged her across 2 state lines on a stolen motorcycle, was pointing directly at the man walking beside her. Kieran stopped in the center of the aisle, not at the altar, in the middle, where every eye could see him. He turned to face the assembled wolves and said, in a voice that was quiet enough to be intimate and loud enough to fill every corner of the cathedral ceiling, "The bonding cannot proceed." The sound that went through the room was not a gasp. It was deeper than that. It was the sound of 300 sets of lungs inhaling at the same time, the sound of an entire political reality cracking down the middle. Nina Ashford did not move. Her face went through 3 phases in 2 seconds: white, red, and then a third thing that was neither color nor emotion but calculation. Pure, cold, strategic calculation. Lena watched it happen and understood immediately that this woman was not heartbroken. She was recalibrating. An older man in the front row stood up. He was broad, silver-haired, wearing the formal blacks of a visiting alpha. His scent hit Lena even from 20 feet away. Old power, old money, old rage. This was Grant Ashford, Nina's father, The Alpha, whose 40-year territorial dispute with the Valdrin pack was supposed to end tonight. Kieran, Grant Ashford said. His voice was the kind of quiet that made everyone lean forward. Choose your next words with extraordinary care. The bond has spoken, Kieran said. He didn't look at Grant. He was looking at Lena. I cannot override it. I would not if I could. You can, Grant said. You can and you will. The treaty requires this union. The treaty requires peace. There are other paths to peace. There is one path. Grant's voice had dropped another register. And you are standing in the middle of it with a rogue wolf who smells like a gas station. Lena felt the blood rush to her face. 300 wolves staring at her, and the most powerful visiting alpha on the continent had just publicly described her scent profile. She wanted to melt into the floorboards. She wanted to run. She wanted to say something clever and devastating that would make Grant Ashford swallow his tongue. What she actually did was stare at a knot in the wooden floor, 6 inches from her right foot, and focus on it with the kind of ferocious concentration usually reserved for diffusing explosives. Kieran moved, not toward Grant, toward Lena. He stepped in front of her, not beside her, in front of her, between her and the room, and the posture was so instinctive, so obviously protective, that every wolf in the lodge recognized it for what it was, a claim. This woman is my mate, Kieran said. She did not choose this. I did not choose this. But the bond is here, and it is real, and I will not sever it to honor a political arrangement. The room erupted, not into violence, not yet, but into noise. Every delegate, every council member, every visiting alpha and beta and gamma began talking at once. The sound hit Lena like a wave, and she did the only thing her body was capable of doing in that moment. She locked her knees, focused on the knot in the floor, and refused to pass out through sheer stubbornness. She almost made it. The last thing she heard before the edges of her vision went black was Kieran's voice, low and close, meant only for her. I've been waiting for you. Then the floor came up to meet her, and the world went quiet. She woke in a bed that could have comfortably housed a small family. The sheets were white, the blankets were heavy, and the room smelled like cedar, and the particular kind of wealth that doesn't need to announce itself because every surface does the announcing. The ceiling was timber-beamed. The windows were tall, arched, looking out onto a pine forest that went on until it hit the mountains. The furniture was dark wood, simple, expensive in the way that things are expensive when they're built by hand and built to last. There was a fireplace with actual fire in it. There was a glass of water on the bedside table. There was a man sitting in a chair by the window, watching her. Kieran Hale had taken off the ceremonial jacket. He was in the white shirt now, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and Lena noticed, because her brain had apparently decided to process irrelevant details with crystal clarity while ignoring the apocalyptic ones, that his forearms were tanned and that the blood from the iron door had dried in a thin line across his knuckles. "How long?" she said. Her voice came out like gravel. 4 hours. 4 hours. She sat up. The room tilted, then steadied. "Where am I?" "My quarters." She stared at him. He met the stare without flinching, without smiling, without any of the social niceties that people use to make uncomfortable situations feel manageable. He just looked at her the way a person looks at something they've been searching for and have finally found. "You need to eat," he said. "There's food on the table by the door." She didn't move. "What happened?" After I went down." The ceremony was suspended. The Ashford delegation withdrew to their guest quarters. My council convened an emergency session. Grant Ashford has given me 72 hours to reject the mate bond and complete the marriage to Nina, or he will declare the bonding breach an act of war. He said this the way a person reads a weather report. Factual, measured, as if continental war were a scheduling inconvenience. "War," Lena said. 3 allied packs, the Ashfords, the Morans, and the Delacroix, combined forces of roughly 2,000 wolves against our 800. Because of me. because of a political system that uses marriage as currency. You are the catalyst, not the cause. That's a very generous distinction for a man whose entire world just caught fire. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the ghost of one, the architectural blueprint of a smile that hadn't been approved for construction yet. You have a mouth on you, he said. I have a lot of things on me, mostly road dirt and regret. He stood up. He was even taller than she'd registered in the corridor. Tall, in a way that reorganized the proportions of every room he entered. He walked to the table by the door and picked up a plate of food and brought it to her and set it on the bed beside her without asking if she wanted it. Eat, he said. Then we talk. She ate, not because he told her to, but because her body had remembered that it existed and that it hadn't had a real meal in 3 days. The food was simple: bread, cheese, fruit, sliced meat, and it was the best thing she'd tasted since the last time she'd had access to food that hadn't been wrapped in cellophane. While she ate, he talked. Not about the political crisis, not about the bond. He told her about the dreams. 3 years ago, his wolf had found her, not physically, across the bond, through whatever metaphysical channel connects mates before they've ever met. He'd started dreaming about a woman he couldn't see clearly, couldn't name, couldn't locate. The dreams were fragments: a highway at night, the smell of coffee and grease, a pair of hands scrubbing a counter, a face turning away before he could fix its features. His wolf would wake in the middle of the night and howl at nothing, pointing towards something in the southeast that Kieran couldn't find on any map. He'd sent scouts, discreetly, without telling his council, without telling anyone except his beta, a man named Owen who'd been his closest friend since childhood. Owen had searched for 2 years and found nothing because Lena had done exactly what she'd intended to do. She'd disappeared. Eventually, Kieran had given up. He'd decided the bond was a phantom, a malfunction, a wolf's delusion. And when Grant Ashford had proposed the political marriage as a condition for peace, Kieran had agreed, because what was the point of holding out for a mate who didn't exist? You agreed to marry someone else, Lena said, because you thought I wasn't real. Yes. And then I showed up. Yes. Covered in road dirt. Yes. During your wedding. I am aware of the timing. She put the plate down. She looked at him, really looked, not the panicked glance of recognition she'd given him in the cell corridor, but a full, measured evaluation. He met it. He didn't perform confidence or project calm or do any of the things that powerful men do when they want you to feel safe. He just stood there and let her see him. I didn't ask for this, she said. I know. I've spent 3 years building a life that doesn't include wolves. Any wolves. I left that world, and I left it for a reason, and I am not interested in being pulled back into pack politics because some cosmic biology decided I belong to someone. You don't belong to me. Your wolf disagrees. My wolf wants what it wants. I am not my wolf, and you are not yours. He paused, although yours seems to have been the one driving. He was right. Her wolf had dragged her here. Her wolf had overridden 3 years of careful, deliberate distance and hauled her across state lines like luggage. Lena wanted to be angry about that, and she was, but the anger was tangled up with something else. The first sensation of safety she'd felt in 3 years. The horrible, inconvenient, undeniable fact that standing in this room with this man she'd never met, she felt more at home than she had since she was 17. She hated it. She hated that her body was a traitor. She hated that her wolf was right. The doors aren't locked, Kieran said, as if reading her thoughts. Nothing in this building is locked. You can leave whenever you want. She looked at the door. It was open, actually open, not just unlocked, but standing ajar with the hallway visible beyond it. That seems like a security risk, she said, given that your political enemies are staying in the same compound. You are not a security risk. You don't know what I am. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his gray eyes. Not curiosity, not assessment, but recognition. As if he could see the shape of the thing she was carrying, without being able to name it. The scars she didn't show. The flinch she controlled. The way she'd positioned herself on the bed, with her back to the wall and a clear line to the door. "No," he said quietly, "but I'd like to." He left the room. The door stayed open. She could hear his footsteps moving down the hallway, unhurried, deliberate, fading. She sat in the bed that cost more than her annual income and stared at the open door and listened to the fire crack and tried to remember the last time someone had given her a choice without conditions attached. She couldn't. Lena tried to run at dawn. Not dramatically, not with any real plan, just the way an animal in an unfamiliar enclosure tests the fences. She got dressed in the same filthy truck stop uniform because it was the only clothing she had, walked through the open door, down the corridor, past 2 guards who watched her but didn't stop her, through the main hall of the lodge and out into the morning. The compound was larger than she'd realized in the dark. A dozen buildings spread across a clearing that backed up against a mountain, training grounds to the east, a medical building, what looked like a school. This wasn't just a pack headquarters, it was a village, a community, and it was waking up around her with the sounds of life. Children's voices from somewhere distant, the clang of metal from a workshop, coffee, bacon, wood smoke, the smells of a world that functioned, that had roots, that had things Lena had spent 3 years pretending she didn't need. She crossed the clearing and headed for the tree line. The pull in her chest tightened with each step, a rubber band being stretched toward its breaking point. She ignored it. She was good at ignoring pain. She'd had practice. She made it about 200 yards into the forest before her legs stopped working. It wasn't collapse. It wasn't weakness. It was her wolf, rising up inside her like a wall and simply refusing to let her body go any further from the source of the bond. Every step forward felt like her ribcage was being disassembled, one bone at a time. Her lungs constricted, her vision blurred. She stood between 2 pine trees, hands on her knees, breathing through the sensation, and thought about the sheer unfairness of being trapped not by walls or guards or chains, but by her own biology. "You done?" said a voice behind her. She spun around. A man was leaning against a tree about 10 feet back. Not Kieran. This one was shorter, stockier, red-haired, with the kind of face that was designed specifically for looking unimpressed. He had his arms crossed, and he was watching her with an expression that said he'd seen this exact scene play out before, and it had been boring the first time. "Owen," he said, "Beta of the Valdrin Pack, Kieran's second. Also, unfortunately, the person responsible for making sure you don't get yourself killed before he has a chance to be dramatic about you. I don't need a babysitter. And yet here we are." She straightened up. The pain eased slightly, not because she'd moved back toward the compound, but because her wolf had won, and it knew it. It settled inside her with smug satisfaction, and she wanted to reach into her own chest and strangle it. "How far did the last one get?" she asked. Owen raised an eyebrow. "Last one?" "The last person who tried to walk away from a mate bond. How far?" "About half a mile. Then he threw up and passed out in a ditch." Owen pushed off the tree. "You made it further than that. Respect." He walked her back to the compound. Not as a guard. He walked beside her, hands in his pockets, commentary flowing in a steady stream that she suspected was designed to distract her from the fact that she was functionally a prisoner of her own endocrine system. He told her about the compound, the pack hierarchy, the 72-hour deadline that was currently ticking down like a countdown to something nobody wanted to name. "Grant Ashford isn't stupid," Owen said. "The marriage was always about territory, not affection. Nina doesn't love Kieran. Kieran doesn't love Nina. This was a business deal, and Kieran just walked out of the negotiation with the ink still wet. So what happens in 72 hours? If Kieran doesn't reject you and complete the bonding with Nina? War. Real war. Not posturing, not border skirmishes. Ashford has the Moran pack and the Delacroix pack on speed dial. Between the 3 of them, they outnumber us nearly 3-1. And Kieran knows this. Kieran has done the math. He does not care. He should care." Owen stopped walking. He looked at her with an expression that was no longer unimpressed, but something closer to curious. You really don't get it, do you? Get what? The mate bond isn't a preference. It isn't a choice. For an alpha, it's a physiological imperative so deep it overrides survival instinct. Kieran would rather watch his pack burn than sever the bond. That isn't romance. That's biology. That's insanity. Welcome to the wolf world. You've been gone a while, so maybe you forgot how stupid we all are. She hadn't forgotten. She remembered exactly how stupid the wolf world was. She remembered the torches. Owen delivered her to the main lodge, where a woman named Maggie, gray-haired, soft-spoken, clearly the person who kept the entire compound from falling apart through sheer organizational will, took one look at Lena's truck stop uniform and said, "Right, come with me." Maggie gave her clothes, simple things, a dark sweater, jeans, boots that fit. She showed her to a bathroom with hot water and soap and towels, and Lena stood under the shower for 20 minutes, letting the road wash off her, while the mate bond hummed in her chest like a low-frequency transmitter she couldn't turn off. She dressed. She looked at herself in the mirror. Without the uniform, without the road dirt, she looked like a person. She also looked like a person who hadn't slept properly in 3 days, who'd been running on adrenaline and gas station jerky, and whose eyes had a slightly feral quality that no amount of soap was going to fix. She found Kieran in a room she hadn't seen before, a study, wood-paneled, books lining the walls, a desk covered in maps and documents. He was standing at the window with Owen, and they were talking in low voices that stopped the moment she entered. Kieran looked at her, looked at the clean clothes, the wet hair, the new boots. Something shifted in his expression, subtle, barely there, like a crack in concrete that only shows when the light hits it at the right angle. "Better," Maggie said, from behind Lena, in the tone of a woman who had just solved a problem and expected credit for it. "Thank you, Maggie," Kieran said, without looking away from Lena. Maggie left. Owen looked between Kieran and Lena, said, "Right, I'll just go stand in a hallway somewhere," and also left. They were alone. "I tried to leave," Lena said. "I know. Owen told me. You sent Owen to follow me." "I sent Owen to make sure you didn't collapse in the forest alone. There's a difference." "Is there?" "You came back. My wolf dragged me back. My wolf has been making decisions for me since Tuesday, and I'm running out of patience with it." Kieran leaned against the desk. "Ask me what you want to ask me." She hadn't expected the invitation. She'd expected him to manage the conversation, to steer it towards something productive, to treat her like a piece on the board that needed to be positioned correctly. Instead, he was standing there with his arms crossed and his gray eyes open, and he was giving her the floor. "Why?" she said. "You could sever the bond, you could complete the marriage, you could prevent a war and save your pack and keep everything you've built. Why won't you?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, stripped of the authority he wore like a second skin, raw in a way that made her realize the authority was the costume and this was the man underneath. "Because I have spent my entire life doing the strategic thing, the rational thing, the thing that preserves the pack and maintains the alliance and keeps the peace. I have been alpha since I was 21. I have made every decision with 800 lives on my shoulders, and I have never once made a decision for myself." He paused. "You are the first thing in my life that is mine." The words landed in the room and stayed there, taking up space, refusing to be diminished by context or qualification. Lena felt them in her chest, not the mate bond, not the wolf, but something older and more dangerous, something human. She looked away, at the maps on his desk, at the territorial boundaries drawn in red and blue, at the lines that represented alliances and the gaps that represented wars waiting to happen. "Your council wants to sever the bond," she said. 6-3. "They voted while you were unconscious, and you told them that I would face anyone who tried to enforce it. You threatened your own council. I stated a position. That's a hell of a position for a man who's known me for 12 hours. I've known you for 3 years. You're the one who's new to this. The logic was infuriating, because it was true. He'd been dreaming about her, searching for her, giving her up, and finding her again while she'd been mopping floors and pretending wolves didn't exist. He had a 3-year head start on this bond, and she was still standing at the starting line. She sat down in the chair across from his desk. She was tired, bone-tired, soul-tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix because the exhaustion isn't physical. "Tell me about the political situation," she said. "All of it. Don't simplify it and don't leave things out because you think they'll scare me," he told her. The Ashford dispute went back decades. Territorial claims in the eastern ranges that had led to border conflicts, that had led to casualties, that had led to blood feuds. The marriage between Kieran and Nina was designed to merge the two territories and create a unified power structure that would make further conflict pointless. Grant Ashford had proposed it because his pack was financially overextended and needed access to Valdrin resources. Kieran had accepted it because his pack was tired of war and deserved peace. The Morans and the Delacroix were opportunists. They'd aligned with Ashford not out of loyalty, but out of self-interest. If Ashford went to war with Valdrin and won, the spoils would be divided 3 ways. If Ashford went to war and lost, they'd quietly withdraw and pretend they'd never been involved. They were fair-weather allies at best, but their numbers tipped the balance. "And Nina?" Lena asked. Kieran considered the question. "Nina is the most intelligent person in this compound, including me. She did not want this marriage for love. She wanted it for power. The question is whether she can be offered power through a different channel." "You think she can be negotiated with?" "I think Nina Ashford has been treated as a pawn her entire life by a father who sees daughters as currency. I think if someone offered her the board instead of a square on it, she would take it. That's a generous reading of a woman you just left at the altar. It's an accurate one." Lena stared at him. He met it. He always met it. This man did not flinch, did not look away, did not perform composure. He simply was composed, the way a mountain is composed, and it was both reassuring and maddening because Lena had built her entire survival strategy around being the most guarded person in any room, and this man was making her feel transparent. "I need you to know something," she said. "Tell me. I'm not going to be a Luna. I'm not going to stand beside you at ceremonies and wear furs and chains and represent your pack. That's not who I am. I don't even know who I am right now. 2 days ago, I was pouring coffee at a truck stop, and my biggest problem was a trucker who kept calling me sweetheart. I am not equipped for this. You don't have to be anything. You keep saying that, but the world around you is demanding something, and I'm the variable that's throwing the equation off. You're not a variable. You're the answer to a question I stopped asking." She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to scream at the poetry of it, at the way he could take something terrifying and make it sound inevitable, at the unfairness of a man who was simultaneously offering her everything and asking for nothing while the entire political structure of his world crumbled around him because of her existence. Instead, she said, "Your council voted to sever the bond." "Yes. What does severance involve?" His face changed. The composure cracked. Just a fracture, just a hairline, but she saw it. "It's a ritual. It hasn't been performed in 200 years. It involves—" He stopped, started again. "It's painful, for both parties, and it's permanent." "How painful?" "I will not describe it to you. Because you're trying to protect me. Because I am trying to stay calm, and describing that procedure does not support that goal." The way he said it, tight, controlled, the words measured out like medicine, told her everything the description would have. It was bad. It was worse than bad. And 6 of his 9 council members had voted for it, as if it were a scheduling decision. "Okay," she said. "Okay what?" "Okay, I'm not leaving. Not because of the bond, not because my wolf won't let me. Because you have 72 hours before a war starts, and I'm not going to spend those 72 hours hiding in the woods while you fight for something I'm part of whether I like it or not." Something moved in his gray eyes. Not relief. It was too deep for relief, too old, too hungry. It was the look of a man who had spent 3 years calling into the dark and had just heard a voice answer. "There's one more thing," she said. "What?" "The truck I came here on. It's still in the woods where your sentries grabbed me. I need it back." "You stole a motorcycle to come here. I borrowed it from a man who owed me $40. The crack in his composure widened by a millimeter. It might have been a smile. It might have been something more dangerous. "I'll send someone to retrieve it," he said. "Thank you, Lena." It was the first time he'd said her name. She hadn't told it to him. He must have pulled it from the bond, or from Owen, or from the sentries, or from the part of himself that had been dreaming about her for 3 years. However he'd gotten it, the sound of it in his voice did something to her chest that had nothing to do with wolf biology, and everything to do with the ordinary, devastating human experience of being known. "Yeah?" she said. "Thank you for staying." She nodded. She didn't trust her voice. She looked at the maps on his desk and thought about the 40 hours remaining on the deadline, and the 6 council members who wanted to take a piece of her away, and the 3 allied packs gathering on the border, and she thought, "I was pouring coffee 3 days ago. I was mopping floors. I was invisible." She had never felt less invisible in her life. The next 48 hours were a siege in slow motion. Kieran spent them in council chambers, in closed-door negotiations, intense conversations with border captains and intelligence officers and alliance brokers. Lena spent them mapping the compound, learning its rhythms, memorizing its exits. She counted 7 ways out of the main lodge, 4 out of the medical building, 12 out of the compound itself if she went through the training grounds and over the eastern fence. She cataloged them the way other people catalog recipes or phone numbers, automatically, without thinking, because survival planning was the only hobby she'd ever had. She didn't see Nina Ashford. The Ashford delegation was housed in the west wing of the compound, separated from the main lodge by a courtyard and 2 sets of guards, and the boundary between the 2 territories, within a territory, was observed with the kind of rigid politeness that people use when they're one provocation away from something irreversible. Owen became her shadow, not by Kieran's order, she'd verified this twice, but by his own decision, because Owen was the kind of person who saw a situation heading toward disaster and decided the most useful thing he could do was stand next to the disaster and provide commentary. "The council is leaning harder on severance," he told her on the second morning, sitting across from her at a long wooden table in the main hall, while she ate breakfast and pretended she could taste it. "Ruth, she's the senior elder, is pushing for a compromise. Keep the bond, but formalize the Ashford marriage as a political arrangement. Separate sleeping quarters, separate lives. The bond exists, but the marriage satisfies the treaty." And Kieran? Kieran told Ruth that he'd rather eat the treaty than share a title with a woman who isn't his mate. He has a flair for the dramatic. He has a flair for making my job impossible, is what he has. Lena pushed her food around the plate. The bond was calmer now, not quiet, never quiet, but steady. She could feel Kieran's location without looking for him, a constant awareness in her peripheral consciousness. He was in the council chamber, 2 floors above, and his heartbeat was elevated, which meant the meeting was not going well. What was she like? Lena asked. Nina, before all this. Owen considered the question. Sharp, controlled. The kind of person who walks into a room and finds the power center in 30 seconds. She's her father's weapon, and she knows it, and she's been waiting for a chance to be something else. Something like what? Something with her own name on it. Lena filed that away. It matched what Kieran had said, that Nina wanted power, not love, and that the marriage was a means to an end that might have other means if someone bothered to find them. The deadline ticked. 36 hours became 24, 24 became 12. On the evening of the second day, Lena was standing on the steps of the main lodge watching the sun set behind the mountains, when a figure emerged from the west wing courtyard and walked directly toward her. Nina Ashford was even more imposing up close. She moved the way predators move, efficient, unhurried, every step placed with intention. She was dressed simply now, dark clothing, no ceremonial furs, and the silver chains were gone. Without them, she looked less like a bride and more like a general. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, looked up at Lena. The silence between them was the kind that has texture, dense, weighted, charged with everything neither of them had said. "Walk with me," Nina said. It was not a request. Lena recognized the tone. It was the tone of a woman who had been giving orders her entire life and had stopped noticing that she was doing it. But beneath the authority, there was something else, something careful, something that sounded, if Lena listened closely enough, like a proposal. They walked, through the courtyard, past the training grounds, along a path that wound through the edge of the forest. Nina didn't speak for the first 5 minutes. She walked with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes forward, and Lena walked beside her and waited, because Lena had learned a long time ago that the person who speaks first in an uncomfortable silence is the person who loses. "You're not what I expected," Nina said finally. "What did you expect?" "Someone larger, someone with presence, someone who would justify the destruction of a treaty that took 6 months to negotiate." "Sorry to disappoint." "What?" "I didn't say I was disappointed. I said you're not what I expected. Those are different things." Nina stopped walking. She turned to face Lena, and her black eyes were steady, unreadable, and very, very awake. "Let me tell you what I see," Nina said. "I see a woman who showed up at a bonding ceremony covered in road grime and smelling like an interstate rest stop. I see a woman with no pack, no territory, no name recognition, and no political value. I see a woman who has single-handedly derailed the most important alliance on this continent by existing." She paused. "And I see a woman whose hands haven't stopped shaking since she got here, who flinches when doors close behind her, and who has counted every exit in every room she's entered since she arrived. I see a woman who has been running from something, and I want to know what." Lena's hands were shaking. She put them in her pockets. "That's not your business. Everything that affects this pack is my business. Or it was, until you showed up. I didn't choose this. Neither did I." Nina's voice dropped half a register. "I was promised a throne. I prepared for a throne. I redesigned my entire life around a throne. And then a stranger walked in, and the throne walked away. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Sorry is useless. Be practical." Nina's eyes narrowed. "Your mate is going to get his pack destroyed. He knows this. He's choosing you over 800 lives, and he will not be moved. I have watched him in council sessions. I was not invited, but I have ways of watching. And the man is a wall. A wall that has decided to be in love with you. He's not in love with me. It's the bond. The bond is a catalyst. What he's doing with it is a choice. And it's a choice that will cost this pack everything unless someone redirects the energy." "Redirects it how?" Nina smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a strategic smile, the kind that rearranges the furniture in a room without moving a single chair. "I don't want Kieran Hale," she said. "I never did. What I want is influence. Territorial governance. A seat at a table where decisions are made. The marriage was a delivery mechanism for those things, but it was never the only delivery mechanism." "You're saying there's a deal to be made." "I'm saying there's always a deal to be made. The question is whether you're smart enough to see it and whether your mate is flexible enough to accept it. What do you want?" Nina laid it out with the precision of someone who had been planning this conversation since the moment the ceremony doors blew open. She wanted a co-governance seat on the Valdrin Council, not honorary, not advisory, but voting. She wanted territorial concessions in the eastern ranges that would give the Ashford Pack access to mineral rights they'd been fighting over for decades. She wanted a formal recognition of Ashford's sovereignty in their home territory, ending the Valdrin claim that had been the root of the dispute. In exchange, she would stand down the Ashford threat. She would call off her father. She would publicly reframe the failed bonding not as a humiliation, but as a strategic evolution. Two packs finding a better path to partnership than a forced marriage. "Your father will agree to this?" Lena asked. My father will agree to whatever I tell him to agree to. He thinks he controls me. He is incorrect. Lena studied her. Nina Ashford was terrifying in the specific way that deeply competent people are terrifying, not because she was aggressive, but because she was precise, and because every word out of her mouth had the weight of a woman who had already wargamed every possible response. Why are you telling me this instead of Kieran? Because Kieran is an alpha, and alphas don't negotiate. They posture, they protect, they make declarations about dying before they'll bend. It's very impressive and completely useless in a political crisis. Nina tilted her head. You, on the other hand, just spent 3 years surviving alone in the human world. You know what compromise looks like. You know what swallowing pride tastes like. You're the only person in this compound who might be able to get through to him. You want me to broker a deal between you and my mate. I want you to save 800 wolves from a war that doesn't need to happen. How you frame that is your business. Lena stood in the forest, with the setting sun turning the pines gold and the mountain air cold against her face, and she thought about Kieran standing in front of his council, saying he'd fight anyone who touched her, and she thought about Owen, saying the man was a wall, and she thought about 72 hours ticking down to 12, to 10, to 8. And she thought about Nina Ashford, brilliant, ruthless, discarded by a system that treated her as a pawn, standing here offering a way out that nobody else had thought to look for. I need to talk to Kieran, Lena said. Yes, Nina said. You do. She found him on the roof. Not figuratively, he was actually on the roof of the main lodge, sitting on the cedar shingles, with his legs stretched out and his back against the chimney stack, and his face turned up toward a sky that was going from gold to violet. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, tired. Not the composure, not the authority, not the wall that Owen described. Just a man who had been carrying 800 lives and a mate bond and a collapsing political order for 72 hours without sleep. She climbed up. It took her 3 attempts because the roof access was a maintenance ladder on the north side that was not designed for casual use, and by the time she reached the peak she was slightly out of breath and deeply committed to never admitting it. She sat down beside him. Not close, 3 feet of cedar shingle between them, a deliberate distance that acknowledged the bond without surrendering to it. How did you know I was up here? He asked. She tapped her sternum. The bond. She could feel his location the way she could feel her own heartbeat. Constant, involuntary, undeniable. That must be inconvenient, he said. You have no idea. They sat in silence for a moment. The compound spread below them, lights coming on in windows, smoke rising from chimneys, the sounds of a community settling in for the night. From up here, it looked peaceful. It looked like the kind of place that deserved to survive. I talked to Nina, Lena said. Kieran's jaw tightened. Just a fraction. When? An hour ago. She came to me. And? Lena told him, all of it, the co-governance seat, the territorial concessions, the mineral rights, the reframing of the failed bonding as a strategic evolution. She laid it out the same way Nina had laid it out for her, precisely, completely, without editorializing. Kieran listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The sky had gone from violet to dark blue. Stars were appearing. She came to you, he said finally, not to me. She said you wouldn't negotiate. She's right. She's right that you won't negotiate. Or she's right to come to me. Both. He turned to look at her. You think I should take the deal. I think 800 wolves shouldn't die because of a mate bond. They wouldn't die because of a mate bond. They would die because Grant Ashford is a territorial predator who has been looking for an excuse to annex Valdrin land for 40 years. That's a distinction that won't comfort the dead. He flinched. It was tiny, the barest contraction of the muscles around his eyes, but she saw it, and she understood what it cost him. He was not a man who flinched. The deal Nina is proposing gives the Ashford pack more than the marriage would have, Lena said. She gets a council seat, territorial concessions, mineral rights. It's more power, more autonomy, more independence than being your wife ever would have offered her, and in exchange, you keep your pack intact, you keep the bond, and nobody dies. And I look like a king who can be pushed off his own altar by a rogue wolf and then negotiated into submission by the woman he jilted. You look like a king who found a better solution than the one he started with. That is a very optimistic reading. It's the only reading that doesn't end in a war. Kieran looked at the sky. His profile against the darkening blue was sharp, defined, the kind of profile that belonged on a coin or a wanted poster. His jaw was tight, his hands were resting on his knees, and they were very still. "There's a faction," he said quietly, "inside my own pack. Wolves who see the mate bond as weakness, who believe an alpha who can't control his own biology, can't control a territory. They've been quiet, but they're watching. If I take this deal, if I concede to the Ashfords, they'll see it as confirmation." "Who?" "Declan Marsh, my third in command, former military. He's been positioning himself as an alternative for years. Patient, careful. The kind of wolf who doesn't challenge you until he's certain he can win." "Is he certain?" "Not yet, but a perceived weakness from me would move the needle. So you're fighting on two fronts." "I am always fighting on two fronts. That is what it means to be alpha." Lena pulled her knees up to her chest. The night air was cold, and the bond was warm in her chest, and the contradiction of those two sensations, the chill and the heat, the danger and the safety, was the most honest summary of her life she'd ever experienced. "Take the deal," she said. "Handle Declan later. You sound very certain for someone who's been in the wolf world for 3 days." "I'm certain because I've been outside the wolf world for 3 years. From out there, the whole system looks like a machine that eats its own parts. You can either keep feeding it or you can change the gears." He looked at her. The tired man was still there. She could see him behind the alpha, behind the composure, behind the gray stone eyes. But there was something else now. Something that looked, improbably, like hope. "Nina will need to present the proposal formally," he said, "in front of the full council and the Ashford delegation. If Grant agrees, we sign a new treaty. If he doesn't, Nina said she controls her father. Nina believes she controls her father. There is a meaningful difference. Then I guess we find out which one it is." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "You climbed a maintenance ladder to get up here." "Yes. In the dark." "It's a ladder. It goes up. Not complicated. Most people use the stairs inside the building." "There are stairs?" The crack in his composure opened wide enough to let something through that was, unmistakably, a laugh. It was short, startled, the kind of laugh that escapes before a person can catch it, and it changed the entire geometry of his face. He looked younger. He looked human. He looked like someone she might have met in a different life, under different circumstances, in a world where neither of them carried the things they carried. She didn't laugh back, but something inside her chest shifted. Not the bond, not the wolf, but the tight knotted thing she'd been carrying for 3 years. It loosened, just a fraction, just enough to notice. "There are stairs," he confirmed. "I'll show you on the way down." "I'm fine with the ladder." "I know you are." They sat on the roof until the stars were fully out, not touching, not talking, just existing in the same space while the countdown to peace or war ticked forward beneath them. The council session the next morning was a battlefield dressed in formal clothes. The great hall had been reconfigured. The ceremonial decorations from the bonding were gone, replaced by a long oak table that ran the length of the room. Kieran sat at the head. His 9 council members flanked both sides. The Ashford delegation, Grant, Nina, and 4 senior Ashford officers, occupied the far end. Owen stood behind Kieran's chair. Lena stood against the wall by the door. She had not been invited to sit. She had not been invited at all. She was there because she'd walked in and no one had told her to leave, and because Kieran had seen her enter and had not reacted, which in alpha body language meant permission. Grant Ashford opened. He was a man who understood theater, the silver hair, the measured voice, the strategic pauses. He laid out the situation with the precision of a prosecutor. The bonding ceremony had been disrupted, the treaty violated, the Ashford pack publicly humiliated. The only acceptable resolution was completion of the marriage or formal war declaration. There were no other options. He spoke for 12 minutes. He did not look at Lena once. When he finished, Nina stood up. Grant looked at his daughter with an expression that was half surprise and half warning. Nina ignored both halves. "There is a third option," she said. She presented the proposal, not as Lena had heard it in the forest, personal, strategic, woman to woman, but formally, with the cadence and vocabulary of a trained diplomat. Co-governance, territorial concessions, mineral rights. A restructured alliance that gave the Ashford pack more than the marriage ever would have, without requiring either alpha to subordinate their bloodline to the other. The room listened. Grant Ashford's face went through a series of micro-expressions that Lena tracked the way a poker player